Hi, I'm Martin Gonzalez. I'm a principal of organ leadership development at Google and the author of the Bonfire Moment. I tend to think of my portfolio career in three platforms, if you will. So the first platform is the core work I do at Google, which is I sit very closely with our senior leaders, especially in the AI research and engineering space, to think about all the people and organizational challenges they have to solve for. And so I enjoy that work where I work really with the heart of Google, where a lot of the future innovations are developed. The second part of this platform is what Google would call a 20% project. So about 9 years ago, I decided to get involved with the startup accelerator that we were building at that point in time. And we'll talk more about this in this chat, I would imagine, but that work, kind of a passion project that I dedicated some amount of time on the side, turned into this workshop that we ran for founders that we first piloted in Southeast Asia, which over time kind of expanded all across the globe to about 70 countries. We did some people analytics on the data we collected about on entrepreneurs through these travels. And eventually this book emerges, comes out of it, which we launched just a few months ago. The third part of this portfolio career, if you will, is I'm a teacher, and I really love spending time in the classroom, educating like the next generation. I'm not that old yet, but spending time with people who are 10, 15, 20 years younger than me. So my primary affiliation is with Stanford University. I teach courses with the business school and the School of Engineering and the design school around organizational culture, entrepreneurship, people analytics. And then I also spent time in Wharton and in INSEAD, which is a European school, teaching on similar topics. I should quickly add that I've recently started to call myself a serial immigrant. So I was born in the Philippines, and through my studies and career, have lived in New York, Jakarta, Singapore, Taiwan, and now based in San Francisco Bay Area with my wife and 3 kids.
And when do you find time to sleep?
I don't know. I try to be very disciplined about my sleep. So I try to be in bed early, and I'm up usually very early to do the deep work. Usually up at 4:30.
Yes, claiming the day. So what time? So this is an entirely personal question. Then, what time do you go to bed if you're up at 4:00?
So I need to be like head on pillow latest 9 p.m. Otherwise, I'll either struggle to wake up or I'll have a bad day.
Okay. It's just whenever I read sort of Miracle Morning or something like that, and he's like, get up at 5 a.m. or get up at 4 a.m. It's like, that's great, but you have to be asleep by 9 o'clock. I mean, you can no longer have a normal social life if such a thing is what you're aiming for.
Well, and look, I'm not a fan of waking up early per se. It's just that I have 3 kids, and by 6:30, they need to be up and getting ready for school. Yeah, it's chaos. It's chaos. And so the only time where the house is quiet and I can really think deeply is really 4:30 to 6:30. Those are the goals. That's where the book was written, in those hours.
Fabulous. And do you know what? I must have completely missed it in the book, right? Because I didn't realize the book, the work that you did that generated the book around these workshops was your 20% passion project. In fact, I suppose it had seeped into my consciousness that the 20% time was now a myth and that it doesn't happen anymore. So I'm pleased it still happens. And I thought that you did this as a full-time thing, as a full-time job. So
yeah. For the record, people still do 20% projects, but you don't expect to do 80% of your job. Like your core job is still 100. So you're actually working 120% of the time. But because these are passion projects, people don't like. I don't mind. Like I would do all of this for free, and then it's not truly. 20% is a day a week. So
yeah,
it's probably more like a 5 to 10% project. Yeah. But that's kind of what the program was called, a 20% project.
Yeah. Well, and also, who are these people who only work 9 to 5, 5 days a week? Like if you've got a job that you're passionate about, that you enjoy, that puts you in flow, then I don't know who these people are that turn up and count the hours and go home at 5 o'clock.
No, I remember catching myself a few years ago telling someone, I don't think I'm a 9 to 5 kind of guy because so sure, like I could be off, I could kind of shut the laptop down by 5, but my mind is thinking and I'm progressing my thing about certain projects, and I might pick up a notepad and think through it as I wind down for and so I'm so with you. The 9 to 5 the 9 to 5 is like we need to change the world of work so people, first of all, I don't if people want to work less hours because they have other priorities and hobbies in life, I'm all for that. But for me, the thought of the 9 to 5 is less about we need to work longer hours and just more about like, is the work meaningful enough that you would actually be willing to put in more time?
I've just come off. We're delivering some online coaching for a client in South Africa at the moment. I've just come off a call that one of my colleagues was running, and I was talking about some work that McKinsey had done, and I said to people, "Look, have you got a hobby?" People put their hands up. It's like, okay, the definition of a hobby is something that puts you in a state of flow, right? You enjoy doing it. Time stands still when you do it, but you're not paid, right?
Yeah.
What if your job was like that? And that's where I think that's what you're talking about. It's like your job is your hobby. You got up at 4:00 in the morning and you enjoyed writing this book. Like, you weren't being paid to write the book, but it gave you joy, so you did it.
Yeah.
And you prioritize that over other things. And so, if you can get, like, if 60% of your job puts you in flow, then, you do it for free. Never work another day in your life.
And you should make sure not to tell your boss or clients that, because you do want to get paid, right?
Totally. So let me just wind you back to the first thing, which is when you were talking about your, what you get paid to do, your core job. What you're on the AI team?
So I am within Google's people operations team. About 7 years ago, we built the org development practice within Google. The way I describe it sometimes to folks is I think of our role as like the business equivalent of the CIA, where we'll come in with very high stakes, in very high stakes environments where, there's a big, strategic pivot or there's a big M&A, like an acquisition deal. We'll come in, we'll usually work behind the scenes, usually with leaders to work through some of these challenges and help them implement. And by the time we leave, no one would see any trace of us being there, but things are better.
That's nifty.
Yeah.
I like, you see, you not only do you enjoy doing it, but you've come up with a way of describing it, which makes it sound really quite cool.
I know. Yeah, I quite enjoyed the work. I used to be like in the business, right? I used to be a product manager and a strategy consultant. And when you're in the business, like you have a quota and you're meeting, and you feel like you feel like the rock star of the company in many ways. When you move into this role, you really have to come to terms with the fact that you will be really behind the scenes, and you're not front of room. You're not kind of the thing that gets talked about to the entire company when they talk about successful products. But you need to believe that the dark arts you practice kind of lead to a lot of these victories.
Do you know, it's funny because that for me, that's the difference that I've had to do as well. No longer running a company, but coaching the people who are running other companies. I'm not even in the company. And so you have to get joy from other people's victories.
Yeah.
And get used to not getting credit. So that's fine too.
Yeah.
But I've got,
that's right.
And you said it's chaos at 6:30 because you're 3 kids. How old are your kids now then?
Yeah. So they're 11, 10, and 8.
Fab. Boys or girls?
Yeah. Girl, boy, girl.
Okay. Fab.
Do you have kids?
I do. I've got 4. I've got 2 older ones, 27 and 25, and then I've got 10 and 8. So
wow.
They started back at school on Wednesday, and they were up at 6:00 because they were so excited to go back to school. So I take them to school most days. It's good fun.
Nice. And so you get your life back now that the school year has started.
Totally. Well, actually, do you know what? during the school holidays, they will stay up late and they won't, you might not see them till 9:00 in the morning. So actually it's, for everybody, it's like the house kicks off again at sort of 6:30 now, through till sort of Christmas. So look, why did you end up running this workshop for startups in the first place? The thing that ended up being, your Bonfire Moment book. What was the genesis of this workshop?
So when we were building the accelerator program about 8-9 years ago, the thesis was, could we do something that really puts Google's technology or technology building at the forefront of this accelerator? And they were looking for volunteers, 20%ers as we'd call them at Google. And when I saw the topics they were looking at, there was nothing about culture and people. And I thought, okay, that's curious. Let me think about how I can contribute. And I went to the data as Googlers are, tend to do. And I found a really classic study out of Harvard that surveyed VCs and asked them, think about the companies in your portfolio that recently failed and what was the top reason for failure. And that study found that 65% of companies failed because of the people factor. And it wasn't what I guess is in the zeitgeist, right? The zeitgeist says, well, it's either you have, technology issues, timing the market right, or running out of cash. These are the things that usually sink startups. But that study showed really that those were far second, third, fourth, fifth reasons for failure. The top one was really, co-founder conflict. Do you have a strong management team? Do you have skills that complement and not duplicate each other? Do you build the right environment, the right kind of team culture, and therefore keep the right people? Or do you tend to keep, the mediocre? So it's all the many things that are really not the sexy part of building a company. And this is why I think in some ways, so we ran the program first in Jakarta, and it was rated the most useful part of what felt like a really robust set of back then it was machine learning boot camps, design boot camps, etc. And we had this leadership workshop for founders. And it was rated as some of the most useful things. And so we said, okay, look, let's try it again. It's probably an anomaly. There's probably something in the food that day. So let's bring it to Bangalore was a second stop. And again, it was rated the most useful. And then ultimately it went to Sao Paulo, to Warsaw, and all around the world. And when I think about why it caught on, it was truly not about the sophistication of the program. I think the program, in many ways, when Josh was convincing me to write the book, I said, look, this program is so vanilla. There's nothing really special about this. But then I came to realize that, so one, founders, when they come into this work, they obsess over the product, especially first-time founders. They don't realize that soon after you hit product market fit, you need to now build a company around this. And they're completely lost on how to do this. And then two, they're really, because they don't spend any time thinking about this, they really don't have the tools at their fingertips to deal with a lot of these dynamics. And so when you provide them a protected space to just talk about in a structured way some of the most painful parts of the experience so far, somehow it's been really valuable to them. So we've been very pleased with it. And look, I never thought I would write a book. And I never thought that humble workshop 9 years ago would turn into this, almost like this worldwide phenomenon. So we're very, it beat any of my expectations.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because the people stuff, the soft stuff, the people who are investing in startups, the VCs, it's the bit that they, I think, find really difficult to advise on as well. I've looked at 100 companies. I've looked at the products. Is your total addressable market good enough? Are you making sales? Is the ARR growing? Okay, I've met you a few times. I quite like you. Here's some money. The VCs listening to this will now, of course, tell me I've completely botched their whole process and made it sound like very simple when it's very scientific. And the founders don't want to go to the VC and say, there's founder conflict, right? We'd rather keep that a secret, or I have no idea how to hire anybody.
That's right.
Because they feel as though they can't help me, but even if I did share that with them, they would feel they would think I have no idea what I'm doing and I'm out of control, right? And so not only people aren't leaning in with help, but also there's a reticence for the founders to share any of these challenges, and then they don't know who to get help from.
No, and so on the VC front, and I've worked with quite a few of them now, trying to put more rigor behind founder selection. I think a lot of the VCs have kind of sharpened their intuition, or believe that they've sharpened their intuition about founder selection through just like seeing so many deals and betting, not betting, and then seeing what the outcomes were. And I think there's some value to that. There's also a lot of bias that seeps in around that. And there's a lot of interesting research around, when an investor is considering a list of companies, and when they see the founder and the founder looks a bit more like them, whether male, female, ethnic, like they tend to be more favored. Like it's all these human biases that kick in that I tend to say, I'm kind of the data guy. Like, don't trust your intuition. Your intuition's probably going to fail you. Trust the data instead. And look, data has its own, it needs to be quality data for sure. But I think on the founder front, you're right. Like, no founder is perfectly honest with their investors. I mean, let's be real, right? Like, bullshit is a very important tool set to have as a founder, which is not. I'm just saying as I've observed it, and not that it should be this way, but I think smart VCs have a tell. Like, there are certain tells there's certain things that they can sniff out, the smart ones at least, to show that this is either a mature or immature team. And, a couple of those are, do they split equity equally? Equal equity splits tend to be a sign that this team has not thought through contributions, skill sets that matter to the company, and that maybe they skirted that tough conversation about, what am I going to contribute? What will you contribute? And how do we reflect that in equity? The other tell is when you have a lot of like co-CEOs, like a lot of shared command, and we talk about this in the book. That's also a sign that, there isn't maturity in, okay, who will ultimately need to make some of the tougher decisions here, and did you have that tough conversation about who's going to be the face of this company? Because there will come a point where there needs to be one face, right? So it's some of those things that I think smart VCs can sniff out. But yeah, otherwise it's hard. Like, otherwise it's these are things that happen in the privacy of team conversations, sometimes in the privacy of a founder's own mind.
So in this workshop, then, for those, we'll give the listeners, the viewers, some sense of what we're talking about. Yeah. Founders only in your workshop.
Yeah.
How long's the workshop when you typically run it?
We've distilled it down to a day with just the tools that we got feedback on were like really the most useful ones. And you're right to underscore, it's a founder only workshop. We have an explicit rule that VCs are not allowed, or investors are not allowed, precisely for the reasons we just spoke about.
And what stage are the founders typically at?
So we've run this workshop across in different versions of it, but we've run it across all these stages. So we started with Series A type startups, or late seeds Series A startups. We over time adopted the workshop for seed stage startups. Later on, did it for unicorns, and some of them are now decacorns. If I don't love the terminology.
Let me just grab you there for a sec, because we've been talking so far, and I think people are probably with us around that sort of seed, late stage A. And then you said we ran it for unicorns. Now you might think that to get to that point, you'd solved some of these problems. But what I know, because of the work I do with clients, that, I mean, I see people who are huge businesses, and they still have not actually dived in and solved these problems. So I think, this is really means that this whole process is applicable for almost anybody.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, what's so interesting about this work that we do, Dominic, is it's like we're not solving for specific business phases. We're kind of solving for the human condition in some ways, right? And when I think about the difference between a seed stage and a unicorn founder or leader, um, there are several versions of the CEO role or the leader role that they need to evolve into. And the way kind of we put some language to that in the book is, you go from being a chief bricklayer to being a chief architect. Early on, you're probably touching the code. You're probably meeting clients face to face. Over time, what a lot of founders really struggle with is I've had a founder tell me once, a part of me died one day, Martin, when I realized that I now have a bunch of these really high caliber professional leaders who are presenting through PowerPoint slides about a company that I built with my own hands. And that moment where there's that loss of control, that there's that psychological distance from like what was your baby once. Like a lot of unicorn founders struggle a lot with that, and then they struggle with the thoughts of like, is this a company I still wanna run, or is it time, or am I only good for the chief bricklayer stage? Am I not a good chief architect? And at that stage, at the unicorn stage, you're not talking about, maybe they're operating in multiple countries or multiple offices, and you have more than just one product. You have, a pretty complex cap table, and at that point, either you are like an extremely adaptable individual and can be that founder CEO for that moment in time, or as many founders do, they decide, look, it's time to bring in a professional CEO.
And do you think, I'd certainly bringing in a professional CEO is, an option. Do you think that that's because many of them don't have a plan or a framework that would say, well, how could I remain CEO?
So my honest answer is I don't know the answer to that, but I am starting to do some research around this question, which potentially could be book 2. And I don't want to, preempt this too much, but here's how I think about this problem, right? What is the difference between a Fortune 500 CEO and a startup CEO? The main difference, as I observe it, is when a Fortune 500 CEO does a good job, they get further entrenched in the job. They stay longer in the job. When a startup CEO does incredibly well, they tend to get replaced by someone who can drive through the scale up. And then there's like about 10%. I need to get more precise. When we start the research, we'll get more precise on this. But there's a 10% of founder CEOs that preside over the IPO of their company.
Yeah.
And I would love to understand, what does it take to be that founder that was there from seed all the way up to IPO? Because in there is probably lessons around extreme adaptability that all of us can learn from.
Well, and it's interesting, if you've seen the work from Bain, they talk about the founder's mentality. And they say those businesses where the founder can become the architect, they've got some research about how they grow, how they do better than when you take the CEO out and replace them with a professional CEO, because you lose at the helm, you lose the person with the soul of the business. The person who's leading the business is no longer the soul of the business, and then you get into that sort of conflict. It's fascinating.
Part of my curiosity around this question is, I have a sense that it's not a question of skill. It's probably more a question of motivation. A lot of founders just don't want to be running a large company. And I, the founder's mentality is a really good one. I think their premise is, we see a lot of big companies that have lost that entrepreneurial spirit. How do you kind of come back to that? And what I love about that book is there's so many things I love about that book. I generally don't like reading books by consultants, but somehow this one stands out. I said, as a former, I spent some good years in consulting as a strategy consultant. But what I love about that book is they talk about how, you have this early stage where you almost have like these barbarians who kind of, conquer new land, right? And the profile of the barbarian, I say that with a lot of love, is like break rules. I cannot be conformed to a rule book. At some point, as the company scales and the founder wants to kind of make sure that the culture continues to be entrepreneurial, they then go in, and this is what HR professionals will do. They'll say, well, let's codify the founder's spirit, right? And that's usually in the form of, a value statement, maybe an employee handbook, maybe some rules. And then what you find is that you then start to hire people who are rule followers because you want them to kind of abide by this codified version of the founder. And then before you know it, what you have is a company of rule followers. And then we're surprised why we've lost the entrepreneurial spirit, right? But there's no easy answer to, well, how do you, like, is that inevitable? I think it's inevitable. I think the counterfactual of not codifying and not having people kind of galvanize around a single way of doing things, I think the counterfactual is chaos, which also is not a good way to build a company. So it's a fascinating problem to solve, I think.
I also think that maybe at about 100, one of the things, again, it's not research based, it's observation. At about 100 people, that implementation of some rules often stifles innovation. And so the company was quite innovative up to a certain point, and then it said, we need to stop going off in all these different directions. And often it doesn't leave enough space. There's not enough space or a process over here which drives the continuous innovation. And so their trajectory plateaus, and then they can't. And then they've done the opposite of Bain's founder's mentality. They've engineered it out, and it's fascinating. Although I was just reflecting about do people want to? Is it the motivation? And certainly I had a guest on the podcast a few weeks ago who got the business to about 100 people and then said, this isn't for me. I don't want to take it from 100 to 500.
Yeah.
I've promoted somebody from within, and I'm off to do, and I'm going back to 6 people again, because that's where I feel like I get the most personal joy, and I don't really, and so it was absolutely motivation. The workshop's a day. Let's dig into some of the things you get these founders to do.
So we start the day with a bit of self-reflection. So part of the work we've done through the years is we've gathered data on entrepreneurs, and we now have a corpus of data that basically shows us what are the successful strategies, the leadership strategies that the most effective founders employ, and we've turned that into a self-assessment where founders can reflect on how well they've done certain things. We've also, we also offer optionally a 360-degree feedback option where you invite, your co-founders, your employees, your board members to weigh in. Incidentally, we're just finalizing some research we did to validate a lot of this study with Valentina Asanova of Wharton. And what's interesting about this is when we look at the data, we find that generally your self-assessment does not predict how effective you are or not. It's really the assessment that people have of you that's more predictive of how well you're actually doing. So anyway, to not go too deep into the data,
I mean, I've seen lots of other research that says the same thing, which is that, as a human being, I'm really pretty crap at knowing how well I'm doing.
Yeah, and you could take that even further and say, like, okay, in our field, Dominic, like, we care a lot about helping leaders build self-awareness. You'd have to think at some point, like, is that even a truly achievable goal? I think degrees of self-awareness, sure. But like self-awareness of which self, right? At some point, there are multiple selves that you need to think through. And
I suspect that there's a motivational thing. I think I'm happy with myself. I get up in the morning, I look in the mirror, and I'm happy. Most people, I'm just thinking back to some research that Gallup did where when they asked people, are you an A, B, C, or D? The people who were C's and D's, based on the company's performance data, thought they were above average. And McKinsey did some work in teams of farmer development teams, and 85% of the teams thought their performance was above average. And so it's not it's not that it's just that the benchmark they have for themselves is completely skewed. So they're measuring themselves against a scorecard which says I'm doing well, rather than knowing that. So, and if you bring in an objective measure, so people don't necessarily want to bring in the objective measure because they don't want to be challenged.
Yeah, well, so there's some nuance. Actually, we spend a whole chapter on this. I think it's chapter 5 on the trap of confidence, and we actually have a more nuanced kind of from our data. This has been studied as broadly, like some people have called it the Dunning-Kruger effect, and we actually saw that on our in our data with the founders, where at a very early stage where there's very low skill, like very low effectiveness of these founders. They tend to overrate themselves. They tend to be very confident about their skills. And then as they get, as in our data set, like we see the most effective founders, they tend to underrate. There's a little bit of this humility that comes with being really excellent at what you do.
Mm-hmm.
And we controlled for things like, likability fact. Like we don't, obviously likable people tend to be rated really well. And we try to control for that in the research. But what's interesting about that early stage, when you have very low levels of skill and think you're incredibly great, there are two things that happen at that stage. One is you don't know what great looks like at that early stage. And therefore you're not aware of the mistakes you're making. You're kind of blindly making these mistakes and not acknowledging it. And I think that's where a lot of people get stuck on believing that they're above average. Maybe.
Yes, I mean, I used to do some yacht racing, and once, certainly on an ocean race, once you're away from the start line and you can't see any other boats, you are absolutely convinced you're doing everything right. And then when all the boats converge again and you find yourself miles away from the front and you go, what did they do? And you have just no idea what they did. It's just...
That's a great visual.
Yeah. And, or sometimes you're in the lead and you think, I wish I knew what it was that we had done that they didn't do. Right. And, in both cases, you are often confused and surprised. So...
And I love that. And so kind of what we try to do in this first part of the workshop is we try to engineer a mini crisis for the founder, right? So or for the leader who's taking it. We try to show them that perhaps their theory of success or their theory of what it takes to succeed is maybe faulty, because perhaps as they get benchmarked against this data set, perhaps they're not really paying attention enough to certain factors, or so that's kind of the start of the day. It's a bit of a kick in the pants. And I should say that the bonfire moment, like we were very careful not to call it a campfire moment. So this isn't like s'mores and hot choco with blankets. Like this is actually like the raging fire of a bonfire. And it's a very uncomfortable day is really what it is. And so that's we start with that. We start with that mini crisis we engineer for leaders. And then we have them write up what we call a user guide. This is something that kind of we drew inspiration from Google. There are a lot of like really popular user guides, but a user guide is simply kind of think about buying a new piece of tech. It tells you how to install, uninstall, troubleshoot. This is a manual that you share with your team that answers a few questions. So one, why am I motivated to work on this startup? What are things that could reduce that motivation? How do I like to receive feedback or resolve conflict? What's the best way? Like, how do you get the best out of me and the worst out of me? If we were to fail, we ask a pre-mortem type question. If we were to fail because of the team dynamic, like here's what I think will be the top reasons for that. And how do we mitigate some of that? What are the expectations I have of myself in this startup? What expectations do I have of each of you? And it's this really robust yet it's a simple yet robust kind of way to basically talk about the things that you tend to find uncomfortable to talk about, or you try to push
you haven't talked about that you'd rather go to the dentist than do this work.
That's right. That's so totally. I love my dentist and I hate it at the same time. The sounds and it's just the drill. Yeah. So that's the second part, and then we go into what I find to be like the one I have most fondness for, which is what we call the bullshit circle. The bullshit circle really comes back to this point on confidence, and we find a lot of founders, externally, most founders look like they're crushing it. Like most founders will kind of play the game of saying like, they're expanding into markets, they're raising funds, etc. They're hiring X new people, employees. And then behind closed doors, when and you probably get this as a coach, like they are crushed by the expectations and the self-doubt and the insecurity that they can't get there. And so the bullshit circle is actually an invitation for them to really have real talk about the insecurities they bring to the work and what are the masks they tend to grab, or what is, to use the language, like what is the bullshit they project out to protect that self-doubt and insecurity. And we'll usually set it up and we encourage, and through the book we encourage them to set it up in a different environment. You might have, one way we've done it is we'd have bean bags in a circle, laptops open, playing a campfire or bonfire video. Sometimes, if it's socially acceptable in your country, like with alcoholic drink, and really talk through like what are some of these challenges. And that for me is the highlight of the day. And then kind of with all that built up, like vulnerability and trust and openness, we then close the day offering the founders and the founding and the leadership team, a list of 20 sources of conflict we've seen startups, experience in our tour around the world. And we invite them to look at that list and say, and think, what are the issues that are either, kind of festering under the surface here, or that we have not talked about that we should anticipate, and talk through some of these. And some of these topics include things like, if one of us doesn't scale fast enough for the business, like what's an appropriate way to talk about offboarding someone from the company? If we were to raise a good amount of funding, do we spend that on vanity things like a nice office space and a prime spot, or do we continue to operate like a bootstrap company? If the media invites one of us to talk about the company, like who do we agree to be the face of this company, i.e. not feel like we've been forgotten or we're an invisible founder in the process. So it's those kinds of like difficult, like things that really blow up later on when you don't have agreements on.
And also, I suspect in the workshop you get huge disparity of perspective. So somebody will say, well, this is what I would do. And, somebody that they didn't know probably until today says, oh, we would do, I was thinking completely the opposite. And so, you get to explore a different perspective in a really safe space.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. We talk about in the book about the trap of the. But by the way, this whole workshop is detailed out in the book. Like the book is a way for us to open source the workshop for anyone to pick up and do themselves. We have a chapter in the book called The Trap of the Inner Circle. And one of the reasons why some of these tough conversations don't get had by these teams is it's very common for startups to start their company with friends and family. At a time when you don't have traction or even cash to pay people, like the only ones that are willing to go along with you on this wild journey are usually your friends and family members. And what tends to happen is and we know this from the research, that those, if that's your origin story, like those tend to be the least stable partnerships. More stable than that are people who find themselves as acquaintances. They kind of find themselves through an interview type process. And then the most stable configuration are former coworkers. Because you had seen each other in professional settings, you know each other's skill sets. You kind of use that professional experience as the baseline for the work ethic you will use in the startup. Now, coming back to the friends and family bit, it's least stable because we know that those relationships are are more expensive than the other configurations, right? It's the personal relationship plus now this new professional relationship that you need to build. And at a point where you need to put the relationship on the line for the sake of the business, most people will find that too expensive, the damage to be too intense to give to the business. And so they will tend not to have those conversations as a result. Right. And so this workshop helps create the conditions to have those conversations.
Yeah. Like we use use a tool from Gustavo Rossetti called Stinky Fish to unpack some of the debt in leadership teams. And it's exactly that. But as you were talking about, starting your business immediately, I thought it sounds like creating a family business, right? So the other place where it shows up, where the difficult conversations are hard to have, is in a more established family business, where somebody has a position of authority based purely on their
the family structure.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. That's right. And that gets tricky, right? Because sometimes, and I've, and look, this is not to say you should quit if this is you, right? That you've started the family. It just means that you need to put in the hard work. I knew of a founder, we actually read them up in the book, Brazilian founder, brothers who were the co-founder. The father was a CFO at some point. The aunt was playing a different role. And there was a sense that, these people did not earn their position. And so there was some performance issues, and they eventually fired the aunt, and they had awkward Christmas gatherings for the next 2 years. Like it's, like,
oh yeah.
But here's the difference, right? So if you're to ask, like, which are the longest standing companies in the world in corporate history? These are actually family businesses. The difference between a family-run business, like a family conglomerate type, versus a startup started by a family is a lot of traditional family businesses tend to be very conservative businesses. Like in traditional industries where you can really grow slowly, you don't take on a lot of like debt or a lot of investment dollars. Where startups tend to be very high risk, kind of high velocity, high intensity environments. I think that's where the combination really falls, really gets tricky.
Yes. Oh, well, I was just thinking, I've watched some of the content from the Tugboat Institute that celebrate businesses that, have been around for 100 years or more. And, they're all multi-generational family businesses.
Right.
But, they can take a long-term view. Startups cannot take a long-term view because, the very nature of it is short-term, high risk.
It's so funny, like long-term in the startup sense is probably 2 years maximum, maybe 4 quarters. And then you look at Toyota, which is professionally run today, but still controlled by the family. They have 100-year plan. 100-year plan. And so you have to think, okay, well, in 100 years, we're probably not on Earth anymore, right? Like we're probably building cars for Mars. Maybe, I don't know.
Oh, they're building spacecraft and not cars. Whatever there is. Yeah, it's fab.
Yeah.
When you look back, what are some of the things that you were doing that you changed around the workshop? Like, what were some of the things that you thought would be great, and then when you did them and you looked at the data, you went, "Nah, that's that." Maybe again, there might be. It's sort of, I'm looking to see if you can bust some myths around things that people think should work, but that in your opinion don't.
So one of the things that we scrapped out or we adjusted very quickly were things around trust building. And I'll tell you why. Like things that are overtly trust building in nature. I think our field overdiagnoses mistrust. I think we are too quick to see a broken team dynamic and think, oh, it's a trust issue. Let's go do trust falls or do rope courses or do games, right? And I think what we very quickly found was what you were solving for there were really symptoms. And when you go down to the roots of some of these trust issues, you start to uncover things like, well, there was a pivot that they did and it was a fuzzy pivot. They didn't quite communicate it clearly. Or because of that pivot, suddenly skill sets were no longer required. When we go from a B2C to a B2B model, suddenly the marketing person doesn't have a role, but they want to hold on to, to the and it's all these layers of like, what is the business? What are we really trying to solve for? Like, what's the direction of this business that you need to solve for? And then you might find that the trust issues kind of self-resolve because a lot of the clarity gets so. And look, that's not to say that sometimes personalities get involved and you need to really stem that, but we want to give a chance to like creating clarity on that first. The second one I would say is, as a professional in this space, like I wanted to think of like what is some of the most sophisticated like decision-making simulations we could create. And we created this one that was based on this Chilean mine rescue that happened years ago. We actually end up writing it up in the book. But that was actually a real part of the workshop that we scrapped because we realized that really what the founders needed were just things that were simple, very actionable, and so it continues to live on in a chapter, but it's now just a story. It's no longer in the final workshop. Yeah.
Okay. What other than the Bonfire Moment, what have you got any other books you think people should read around this topic, or just stuff that you found inspirational in your life?
Yeah. So for me, The Founder's Dilemmas by Noam Wasserman is a real gem. He was at Harvard Business School when he wrote up this book. He was one of the first few people who looked at entrepreneurship and said, we need to put more rigor and data behind some of the people-related, partnership-related issues that we see in the startup space. And so that book actually lays out some of the key decision points leaders need to make. And the way he collected data was so inventive. He knew that founders who were time-starved would never give or will never have the time to give data or to spend time filling out, data collection surveys. So instead, what he did was he created a compensation benchmarking survey because, founders want to know how to pay themselves or how to pay their CTO or whoever else. So it's a compensation survey. But 90% of that survey ends up to be like a lot of his research questions. But to get access to the benchmarks, you would have to. So I thought it was such a brilliant way to collect data from a population that wouldn't typically take the time.
Fabulous. Anything else?
So, the hard thing about hard things is kind of like the Bible that a lot of people cite. A founder once explained it as like a sacred text that depending on what's going on in your life at that moment, you pull out different lessons from it. I think it's a fantastic starting point. I think there are parts of it that I would definitely update. And, I have so much respect for what Ben Horowitz has done and how he's, built many companies. I think there isn't enough in there about balancing techno-optimism with more responsible deployment of tech and yeah.
Okay. Fab. I've got some rapid fire questions for you.
Let's do it.
In a few words, what drives you every day?
Contribution and impact to the world, leaving it a better place than I first found it.
Fab. What's your genius?
Oh, wow. That's my genius. I think people just want to open up to me. I'm not intimidating. I seem trustworthy. And so a lot of my book is just a summation of all the private conversations, masked obviously through the book, of all the painful parts of the journey.
Okay, very good. What unpopular opinion do you hold?
That I think the best place to learn leadership is from cult leaders.
Oh.
Because I think they're masters of psychology.
Yeah.
And so therefore, I spend way too much time watching cult documentaries. Dominic, I can't tell you how many nights I've slept at 4 a.m. because of these documentaries and reading up all I can about all these cults.
Well, that's how Cialdini started. He sort of said, look, all these, people like Hare Krishna, there's a psychological trick to that. So I'm going to study them for his book, Persuasion.
Interesting. And I never put two and two together in the past. Like someone told me once, like, I think the reason why you're fascinated with cults is because you're an org psychologist. And so, essentially this is org psychology. I thought, yeah, that makes sense.
What's the most significant risk you've taken?
I left my strategy consulting job, which was on this money train headed to the glorious, destination, and decided to take a risk and do this people work which to my dad, who was a CFO, kind of like raised his eyebrow at the thought, is that a real job? Like maybe that should be a hobby. I mean, my dad's super supportive. He eventually supported me, but I could imagine how he was writing off his son or his investment in my education when I decided to do this.
Fab. How do you measure success?
I sigh because my mantra growing up is to not measure your worth based on your successes and failures, which is not the question you asked. The way I measure success is I want to raise a healthy, happy family and then be available for the rest of the world. And if I can't strike that balance, then I would have failed.
Fab. What's the most recent thing you've learned or skill you've acquired?
I learned how to replace the fill valve of the toilet in our guest room. And I can't tell you how much of an epic win that feels when you don't have to hire someone to do it. And all I had were some tools and YouTube, and I got it done.
Oh, it's like you become a hunter gatherer, don't you? It's like
that's right.
My wife told me that the toilet is leaking. I didn't ring a plumber. I need a medal.
Yeah. That's right.
Oh, look, I'm with you totally.
You feel so manly after that.
What's the biggest myth in business?
The biggest myth in business is that the enemy is outside. The enemy is a competitor, it's a regulator. I think the true enemy in business is the internal complexity they create for themselves that stunts their ability to grow, their ability to make decisive moves, to gather the right people and extract the brilliance in people. I think that's a real enemy.
Fantastic. Martin, thank you for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today.
I love this. This is entirely enjoyable for me. Thank you.